Welcome, everybody, to the Naiman Graduate Fellow Colloquium. And I wanted to just officially say a word in gratitude to the Naiman Endowment, which came to Japanese studies in 1985. Originally, it funded an endowment for John Dower, who is one of the historians who helped found the Japanese studies program. And later it became earmarked specifically for graduate fellowships for research. And I imagine those of you who've been around a while have seen our university go through many ups and downs for budgets and budget cuts. But this grant has continued, thanks to the Naiman family. This has continued to support graduate student research through no matter what the ups and downs of our budget are. This is still there to support people. And I could find the statistics back to 1997. We've given over 100 grants to graduate students. So I think it's worth remembering the benefactors that have made that possible. We have several presentations today, and they're going to be 10 to 15 minutes with a brief period after for some Q&A. And we're going to start with Vivian Chih, who is in the literature department. Vivian?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Turner, for your introduction. And I'm gonna share my screen with you. Just a second. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So, yeah, hi, everyone. It's so nice to meet you all virtually here today. And I'm joining from Taiwan today, as Kumi said. So my brain is and it's early morning now, so my brain is probably not functioning as properly currently. So if anything is unclear, just please feel free to let me know. And it is my honor to be able to share with you about my trip to Japan on the Naiman Fellowship and to hear about other presenters' stories today. I'm also very delighted to see a few familiar faces today, which make me very reminiscent of the time and my fond memories at UCSD. I graduated from literature department last September and am currently teaching Taiwan-related courses for the CET academic program, which enables American students to study at National Taiwan University for a semester. Okay, so my research trip to Japan from the end of February to around mid-March last year was conducted mainly for my PhD dissertation, which aims to re-examine and intervene in the patriarchal discourse of 20th century Taiwanese art history through the intersectional lens of cultural memory studies and feminist studies. And the media that I use are recently restored paintings and films produced, preserved, and performed by Taiwanese women throughout the 20th century. So there are three primary goals for my trip to Japan, which are first, to observe the aesthetic and stylistic influences on Chinese painters who had received art education in Japan during the colonial era, which was from 1895 to 1945. And second, to learn about art restoration technology and skills in Japan. And third, to visit the institutes that had assisted in restoring Chinese painters' works. So in the following, I will briefly present to you a few of my findings and observations from my trip to Japan. So one of my main stops is the Kuroda Memorial Hall in Tokyo's Ueno district as part of Tokyo National Museum and located just right next to it. And I'm sure a lot of you may have been there before. And I chose to visit this site in memory of Kuroda Seiki because of his great influence on the development and modernization of art education in Japan, as well as his ensuing impact on Chinese painters studying in Tokyo during the colonial era. So Kuroda Seki has been hailed as the father of yoga, meaning Western style paintings in Japanese. And he had first studied law and later painting in Paris for a decade at the end of the 19th century. So during his time in France, he had learned painting from the renowned painters such as Raphael Collin and was deeply influenced by the French Impressionist movement there. And later, he introduced yoga and plein air technique of painting outdoors of the landscapes, as well as the concept of nude art back to Japan from France. So upon his return, he was appointed the director of the newly founded Department of Western Style Painting at the prominent Tokyo School of Fine Arts, which is currently Tokyo Geidai. And so, for example, this painting is among the collection in the Memorial Hall titled Flowering Field Hana no, depicting three nude women casually gathering in the field. According to its description, the painting by Kuroda demonstrates influence from his teacher, Raphael Collin's painting A Corner of the Garden, which also depicts nude women relaxing outdoors. And this is the only existing painting among Kuroda's later larger sized paintings. I could not find A Corner of the Garden painted by Raphael Collin, but I found another of his painting, which is A Dance of Summer on the left, whose style and composition are a bit similar to those of Flowering Field by Kuroda. And this is the sketch for one of the women sitting in the middle of Kuroda's Flowering Field. What has caught my attention immediately when I saw the sketch is its resemblance to the figure of a nude woman in Chinese painter Chen Zhenpo's oil painting, as shown in the middle of this slide. This one. So Chen Zhenpo was one of the most famous Chinese painters from the island's Japanese colonial period. He was born in 1895, which was the year of the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki that ceded Taiwan from Qing China to the Imperial Japan. And he died as a political victim of the turbulent February 28 incident after the Kuomintang, or the nationalist government party, retreated to Taiwan from China following the end of World War II. So in the first chapter of my dissertation, I examined Chen Zhenpo's paintings and his works, which were carefully and secretly preserved by his wife after his execution by the Kuomintang government in 1947. So while focusing on the subjectivity of his wife as Chen Zhenpo's conservator, I also explore the painter's less discussed female nude paintings in relation to Taiwan's gender awareness and public perceptions of nude paintings during the colonial era. So Chen Zhenpo studied at Tokyo Geidai from 1924 to 29 and was enrolled in its yoga department, of which Kuroda Seki was the director. But however, since Kuroda passed away in 1924, Chen Zhenpo probably was not one of his students. But as we can see from this painting of a seated nude woman painted by Chen while he was a student in Tokyo, it's quite evident that he was greatly influenced by the style and painting techniques of yoga that he had been exposed to at the art school. And another example can be found in Chen's nude painting of his wife on the left, painted in 1928, also amidst his studies in Tokyo. And the other two female nude charcoal paintings in the middle and on the right were painted by Kuroda in 1888, when he was a student in France. So when I saw Kuroda's two sketches of nude women in the Memorial Hall, they immediately reminded me of Chen's painting of his wife, Zhang Jie. And again, we can clearly observe the influence they had on Chen's work. The portrayal of Zhang Jie in a state of nudity bears a striking resemblance to the nude sketches by Kuroda Seki, especially the one in the middle of this slide. So both women in Chen's and Kuroda's paintings are depicted standing cross-legged and holding onto a tall object in nearly identical poses, despite the differences in their painting materials and the directions of their faces. And these are a few of Chen Zhenpo's postcard collections on which female nude paintings by Japanese artists are printed, most likely collected when he was studying in Tokyo. And these nude paintings by Chen also demonstrate the sort of the aesthetic and stylistic influence the painter had received in the metropole. And also on another note, this is Kuroda's oil painting of trees in a field painted in 1890 that I also encountered at the Memorial Hall, which reminds me a lot of a 1939 oil painting by Chen Zhenpo entitled Garden, as seen on the right, with the same impressionistic style and also depicting trees in an open field. And this is an oil painting of a nude woman by Kuroda's teacher, Raphael Collin, painted in 1870, collected also by the Memorial Hall. When I saw Raphael's painting in the museum, Chen Jing's leisure on the right-hand side of the slide instantly came to my mind. So Chen Jing is the subject of another chapter in my dissertation, who was a well-known and well-revered Chinese female painter during the island's colonial era, who studied Nihonga, meaning which can roughly be translated as Japanese-style paintings at today's Joshibi University of Art and Design in Tokyo from 1925 to 1929. So Chen Jing's works have been also been selected to exhibit by Taiten, which is Japan's imperial art exhibition, regarded as the highest achievement in the art scene back then. So her Nihonga leisure, as we see here, depicts a Han Chinese woman lying on the canopy bed by herself and reading leisurely. So there is once a Chinese art historian who compares her leisure to the French Impressionist painter Manet's famous painting Olympia on the left, highlighting the implied eroticism and also interpreting the young woman in leisure as a symbol of the colony, Taiwan, while the ubiquitous gaze at the woman represents the colonizer, Japan, and the perspective of Western civilization. But then I would like to take a different approach and argue that the contrast between the traditional and modern in leisure just exemplifies the female painter's attempt to bestow her subject matter with a unique and also independent female subjectivity and her own female gaze. It portrays an independent and also conventional Chinese young woman who is different from the idealized Liu Sai Campbell, meaning virtuous wife and good mother, who would be expected to do household chores and to bear her children and would have no free time for her personal interests. So in other words, the painting to me manifests the female painter's intention to present a modernized and also educated Han Chinese woman rather than depicting a passive colonial subject under Orientalism. And from this painting, Leisure by Chen Jing, we can say that it's also very likely that she was exposed to this yoga, introduced to Japan by painters like Kuroda Seki, while she was studying Nihonga in Tokyo. And the Tokyo National Museum has a relatively small section of Nihonga exhibition there. And here are a few more of Chen Jing's Nihonga, including accordion on the right, exhibited by Taiten in Tokyo in 1935. So her Nihonga, produced after the early 1930s, mostly feature Chinese women, including both Han Chinese and indigenous ones that blend modern and traditional elements and establishing her unique Nihonga style, deviating from Japanese Nihonga painters. And in addition, since my dissertation used restored paintings and also films as my primary media, and in fact, both Chen Zhenpo's and Chen Jing's paintings that I just mentioned were restored through the joint efforts between Taiwanese and Japanese art restorers. This exhibition on art and cultural properties restoration at Tokyo National Museum was also one of my main stops during my trip to Japan. So this section introduces the process and techniques used for restoring arts and cultural properties in Japan. For instance, it features the pre and post restored textile paintings from Liuji, a temple in Nara. And it also explains the process of oil painting restoration in detail. And furthermore, it introduces the technology used for examining the condition of arts and cultural properties before restoration, such as UV, CT scanning, and X-ray. And these non-invasive techniques allow for detailed analysis of the materials, structure, and also condition of the objects without causing any damage. So, for example, I was very impressed by this CT scanning result of a head of a Buddhist statue, which clearly reveals that there are other small objects inside the head of this statue. So through the CT scanning, the restorers found that they are actually an amulet, like this one, and two other smaller statues of Buddha inside the head of this Buddhist statue. So this exhibition just reminds me a lot of how the restorers discovered several of Chen Zhenpo's paintings stacked together, including the pencil sketch of his two nude women on painting on the right, discovered also through X-ray examination of this oil painting on the left. And through the X-ray examination, the restorers of Chen Zhenpo's painting also found numerous vertical features on his oil painting as demonstrated here. Because as mentioned previously, this was a result of the paintings being secretly preserved by his wife in the small attic of their house during the White Terror period in Taiwan, spanning about 38 years and ending in 1987 when Taiwan's martial law was lifted officially. So due to space constraints, his hidden paintings had to be sort of rolled into small scrolls, leading to the formation of these fissures on many of his paintings. So when these fissures were revealed after scanning, the restorers were able to repair them following the direction of the creases, resulting in the restored painting seen on the right. So the exhibition at Tokyo National Museum prompted me to reflect on the transformative impact of advanced technology on art restoration, without which we might not have been able to access the cultural memory of a nation or a society. So in addition to these above-mentioned museums and exhibitions, I also spent a day at the National Film Archive of Japan in Tokyo, learning a bit about the history of Nihon Eiga and watching a film which is The Victory of Women, Josei no Shouri, directed by Mizoguchi Kenji, and featuring the beloved Japanese actress Tanaka Kinuyo. And that is all for my presentation today. And thank you so much for your attention. This trip has enriched and definitely deepened my knowledge about the cultural transmission between Japan and Taiwan, and has verified what Yuko Kikuchi frames as a theory of refracted modernity in her edited book on visual culture and identity in colonial Taiwan. It also reaffirms to me the importance of institutional support for cultural memory preservation and confirms that while discursive theorization is important, the accessibility and also transnational referencing of materiality are also crucial. And finally, I just wanted to take this opportunity to reiterate my sincere gratitude for the generous sponsorship from the Joseph Naiman Fellowship, as well as to Kumi for organizing and coordinating this wonderful online event. I would also like to thank Professor Yao, especially, but I think he's not here today, for his unwavering support for my trip, my research, and my dissertation. So thank you so much. I look forward to your thoughts, comments, and also questions.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank you for joining us from Taiwan. This was really excellent. I think if we're going to stay on time, I think we're going to need to limit some of our questions. So how about if we take two? I saw Anran's hand up, and I saw one question, actually a comment from Stefan in the chat. So Anran, would you like to ask your question? And then you can look at the, if you look at the chat, Vivian, you can see Stefan's comment. Anran, go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much for bringing me into the Q&A session first. So just a very, very general question. I'm very curious that, because your project kind of focus on like Taiwanese art history and feminism. So I just wonder, so during back to the colonial period, so what's the, do you know that usually how were the women artists educated? So how do they learn to paint, and like are they kind of generally accepted to their to those colonial exhibitions just as the same, well, just similar to through the similar process as their male artists?
Yeah, thank you so much, Anran, and it's so nice to meet you here virtually today.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much for your question. Yeah, it was really Chen Jing's example was really a very real one, because she was from a very privileged and very rich family in Taiwan, so in colonial Taiwan. So she was first educated in Taiwan all the way until high school, and then was encouraged by her Japanese art teacher at the high school in Taiwan to study, because of her talents in painting, to study in Tokyo. So then she was also fully supported by her family to financially sponsor her to study in Tokyo. And that was how she managed to spend like a decade from like 1925 to 1934 or 35 in Tokyo without worrying about her financial condition there. So so she could be said as probably the only female painter who could like complete her painting and art education in Japan without like thinking whether to get married after graduation or to earn more money to support herself there. So so yeah, I would say Chen Jing is one of the very few examples of Chinese female painters in back in colonial era who could like sort of manage to thrive in both the art scene in Taiwan and also in Japan, which was very difficult for female painters from Taiwan back then.
Yes, thank you. Stefan, would you like to, you
I
have two comments in your chat. Would you like to summarize and, yeah. Stefan, we cannot hear you.
No,
I think there we go. Thank you.
Your talk just generated a few kinds of associations in me. And one is that your first images, especially the Kuroda images, were just, they struck me as mirroring a lot of the French Orientalist images. And so what that raised in my mind is, Kuroda is taking on the modern European point of view perspective. But you're doing work on Taiwan, so it's kind of an interesting triangulation of colonialism, taking up the imagery of a colonialist place, and so I don't know if it's a replication, a doubling, or an inversion or something. You have different kinds of layers there to think about. And if you're doing work on preservation, my colleague in COM, Fernando Dominguez Rubio, has done a wonderful book on preservation at the Louvre. And I think you'd enjoy reading that. I don't know how extensive your preservation work is going to go, but it's been a very, well, anyway, I think it'd be worth looking at.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would really love to get the chance to read the book if you would let me know the title of the book, and also if time allows in the near future. Yeah. So my research about preservation hasn't gone that far. So far. But I would really like to learn more about the book that you mentioned. Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure if I stopped sharing my screen or not.
I think, well, actually, yes, we still are seeing your screen. So if you can stop, that would be fine. Thank you so much, Vivian. This was,
Thank you.
yeah, if we had more time, we could talk much longer. So I would encourage anyone who has additional thoughts, comments, questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, because we can all still see the chat. And if we have time at the end, we can come back to any one of the presentations. Ramsey, would you like to share your screen now?
I'm sorry, but I could not like enlarge my Zoom sharing. I think I found
Okay, I
how
think you
to-
succeeded. Thank you. So Ramsey Ismail is from Anthropology Department, and you're up next.
All right, just give me one moment. I always get a little tripped up when it comes to figuring out how to share PowerPoint on Zoom on one side and then having what you want to say on another. I think it's
Oh yes, that's a challenge.
Share screen. Where'd PowerPoint go? There we go. Okay, I don't want it on this screen. Swap this. How do I share it without it taking over both of my monitors?
Usually I just click on slideshow mode
Okay.
with the presenter view, because then I'm not sure about your computer. Oh, it's a Mac, so it should work if you just put it on slideshow.
Okay, let's.
I think.
Slideshow. Can everybody see? Okay,
Yeah, we can see everything.
Okay, let's get rid of that. Okay, great. I'm only actually using about 2 or 3 slides out of this, so it'll be okay. Like, can just blow these up for you. Okay, great. Let's just do that. Hi, so my name is Ramsey. I'm in anthropology. I'm in either the 7th or 8th year of my program. Time starts to go really fast once you get towards the end of it. I'm currently writing my dissertation, and my most important and so I originally decided to do my research. So I've been funded by the Naiman Foundation several times. I've been funded to do the language work that I needed to do this, the preliminary summer research that I needed to get involved with hikikomori communities, and then more when I was doing dissertation fieldwork. And so overall, I'm really thankful to the committees that have, awarded me through the Naiman Foundation, because it's enabled a lot of research and a lot of pre-research that went into these projects. Unfortunately, with all that pre-research, I went to Japan to do research during the pandemic. So then I had to sort of, shift gears once I got there. But I was fundamentally interested in the fact that when I was in the US, when the pandemic first hit, I had previously worked with hikikomori, who are long-term social recluses, who, generally stay in their rooms for 6 months to a year to a decade at a time. It really varies. But I was hearing these phrases from my friends in Japan during the beginning of the pandemic, like, we are all hikikomori. We are all hikikomori. And I was seeing certain bits of media and things like that. So I really wanted to see, is there a perception changing? And I was hearing things like, what can we learn from hikikomori during the pandemic? How do we learn how to be alone? And so what I thought I saw was, maybe the potential for some dramatic change in attitude towards this population, towards mental health. It was not that. There were much more nuanced changes that resulted in a changing ecosystem of talking about mental health. So I'll start with this particular research. So 2 key terms, just I want everybody to keep in mind, are this term hikikomori and this term highly sensitive person. And it's someone who is thought to have an increased or deeper central nervous system, a sensitivity to physical emotion or social stimuli. It's a pseudoscientific word. It's not actually part of like the DSM or anything, but it's a very important part of this. And so I'm going to talk about some vignettes from my fieldwork that were important. And I may leave the argument out so y'all can just sort of chew on some of the bits of the anecdotes. It might be more interesting for everybody. But so whenever I tell my friends, family, and colleagues, both in Japan and out, that my research concerns mental health, they often respond, wow, mental health in Japan. They often respond, wow, there must be so much to do there, or that must be a crazy place to do it, reflecting some widely held stereotype that mental health care is somehow non-existent in Japan. We know this isn't the case. Psychological talk flourished in the Taisho era from 1912 to 1926. Japan historically maintained a rich relationship of training psychotherapists in Germany before World War II, then in the US and Great Britain. After psychotherapy flourished during the 1980s until being replaced by biomedical understandings of mental health. And psychiatry is also generally covered by national insurance. So we know that there's not this lack of infrastructure per se. So as a result, while concerns of mental health and illness associated with biology, such as schizophrenia, are often met with empathy and numerous avenues for treatment, discussions of mental health not grounded in a more physical science are much more complicated, despite the ongoing presence of psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and community-based mental health support. So whether diagnosed or not, my interlocutors often have trouble discussing their mental health states and health. Though this seems to be changing rapidly, partially due to the pandemic, which forced many to confront chronic experiences of stress, isolation, and distress, in addition to previously widespread talks about mental health reform spurred by high rates of suicides and ease of access to mental health information on the internet, bringing about this proliferation of pseudo-psychiatric vocabulary. So in this one, I'm going to focus on 2 specific categories, hikikomori and highly sensitive personalities. And I want to show that sort of in an act of pragmatism, folks whose experiences might otherwise fall under the radar of mental health and mental health care elsewhere, such as hikikomori, employ these labels as idioms that produce crucial social inways, such as the ability to get resources and the ability to connect with others. And I think that these words that my interlocutors use to describe their mental health in Japan and the experiences they refer to are not necessarily always accurately defined or even trusted, but in communicating something, provide vital avenues for recovery, connection, and understanding. So one day in late March, seated at small chairs at Rakunokai's bi-weekly event termed the Aldori Cafe, in which the small MPO's office was reorganized into a cafe and talk space for hikikomori. Folks here, I met Matsuno-san, a 46-year-old woman, a second-time attendee at the cafe. Introducing herself to me, Matsuno-san explained to me how she had come to the center. And when I have 5 minutes left, please just hold up a 5 so I can pace myself accordingly. As Matsuno-san explained, she wasn't actually a hikikomori, though in some ways she might seem like one. She said, I have a developmental disability. But I didn't really know that until recently. I'm also a highly sensitive personality type, so I couldn't really handle pressure or loud noises and lights at work. I was also really sensitive and had trouble in school, but I thought I was just a bad person for having so much trouble. We didn't use terms like highly sensitive personality back then, so I didn't get diagnosed with anything until I was 44. Until I was 44. I was having trouble with what I was seeing, so I went to the eye doctor, and he sent me to another doctor. It turned out I wasn't having trouble with my eyes, but I had a developmental disorder. I was dyslexic. I also have PTSD. From a few feet away, across the two thin layers of plexiglass that separated our table into 4 sections, a standard corona prevention measure in Japan. Asano-san, a younger 30s female, self-proclaimed hikikomori who frequented the cafe depending on her mood, chimed in. I'm a highly sensitive personality, and I have PTSD too. She conversed cheerily. Oh no, I haven't been diagnosed. Maybe it's because I'm HSP, short for highly sensitive, too, but I've always had trouble interacting with others, and I remember school was just so hard for me. Excited, Asano-san added, have you been to the hikikomori meetings in Iidabashi, another neighborhood in Tokyo? As well as there's also Hikikomori Anonymous. Hayashi-san, a famous hikikomori author, attends that one as well. She's a great person. We went to dinner the other day, and the table was a little crowded, but we all fit and talked and had coffee too. In this interaction, it was clear that none of these individuals were the severely psychiatrically distressed hikikomori that psychiatrist Saito Tamaki described when he coined the term, nor those depicted in popular media who suffered from acute mental distress and rarely leave home for any reason, let alone to make a go at socializing. Rather, it seemed that in the absence of official diagnosis, folks at Rakunokai were idiomizing their experiences through easily recognizing words such as hikikomori and highly sensitive personality. So this idiomization was useful for 3 reasons. As folks have written of idioms of distress, these words provide an easily understood cultural register of communication and experiences. Second, an apparent irony in the case of hikikomori, which is defined as social withdrawal. These categories offer Japanese people a legitimate avenue for identity, connection, and participation in community. And third, as I would show later, and that's if we get there, they offer a legible, quote, excuse for failing to perform according to certain strict and unrealistic standards or for feeling a certain way. Great. Sano-san wasn't the only talkative hikikomori I met at Rakunokai, nor the only one who I met who was partially employed, had hobbies, or attended numerous events through the network. Nor was hikikomori the only category or pseudoscientific term invoked to describe one's mental health experience. For example, some hikikomori also identify as having a highly sensitive personality, or also having PTSD, or also having depression, or some combination of all or some. And so when I first arrived in Japan for fieldwork, I was initially struck by the numerous organizations and social opportunities that seemed to spring up around hikikomori and other mental health labels as a seemingly casual way these other psychiatric terms were used. Having heard them numerous times, I brought them up in a planning session with Nakamura-san, a former hikikomori I had met at Rakunokai that now worked as a recruiter, helping former hikikomori find new jobs. Gainfully employed, married, and with 2 children, Nakamura-san was actually working to start an NPO that combined sustainability and mental health, recycling raw materials from Japanese capsule toys for toy making activities, and social icebreakers for hikikomori. At one point, we did have to warn him, some of the garbage materials that he was using to make toys for kids weren't necessarily the safest toys in the world. But he specialized in making these icebreakers and getting hikikomori to be able to communicate their lapses in job appointments. So over coffee at a cafe near Shinjuku Central Park, Nakamura-san explained that as a former hikikomori, he had come across the commingling of these words quite often. However, for Nakamura-san, it did not truly matter whether these words were an exact fit. In the absence of actual diagnosis, labels such as hikikomori, PTSD, HSP, whether discovered through the internet, one of the cafes, or otherwise, communicated commensurable experiences and allowed individuals to identify with each other. As Nakamura-san explained, identification with these categories is an important process in Japan, where the limit for what you can be is socially very narrow. So much of one's life is defined by work or school or recognizable social locations, what sociologist Mary Britton discusses as ba. Apart from those avenues, for example, if one quits or drops out, it is hard to have a meaningful identifier and to form relationships because of it. Thus, when my interlocutors introduced themselves as being HSP or hikikomori, even with the potential stigma attached, they gained another legible avenue for recognition as a member of society in Japan. And so one of the drawbacks of these categories, however, was that if you use them incorrectly at work or something like that, you could often, some people got accommodations at their employment for being highly sensitive, right? They couldn't be near an especially loud street or an especially busy area of the office that they could concentrate. The problem was, on one hand, you could get accommodations, but if you had an especially unempathetic manager or an unempathetic supervisor, you could also just as easily be held back in performance reviews, since this wasn't, these aren't necessarily diagnosable mental health categories. Additionally, the use of these categories, as Nakamura explained, as they use them, members could over time come to believe that they failed at something simply because they were hikikomori or HSP. And as such, there were simply things they simply couldn't do, such as make friends or hold to a job and ultimately stop trying. As a result, this pattern of thinking could bring on a cycle that lasted for several periods of time. Many hikikomori experienced on and off relationships that trapped them at home for decades at a time. So in a sense, idiomizing these distresses constitutes a valuable, though flawed, form of pragmatism in a medical ecosystem that more readily treats mental illness than mental health. And situations like this are perhaps important for us to discuss how, something like global health can intervene, in which we can appreciate both local pathways for mental health communication and care, and identify infrastructural weaknesses with potential for improved mental health outcomes. In the meantime, though perhaps slowly, the folks at Rakuno Kai are embodying the change they simply hope to see, opening up discussion spaces, destigmatizing mental health conversations, and making new meaning as they idiomize their experiences. That's everything.
Ramsey, thank you. That was really interesting. And there's a lot of things packed into those stories you told. Questions, we have Dingding and then Kumi.
Oh, no, it's not a question. I'm just shouting out to the
Same.
to the argument that we're all hikikomori. I'm like totally agree.
You think we're not all highly sensitive people, but we're all hikikomori? Ramsey, I have a question at the end. You said something I found actually interesting, because you're thinking cross-culturally about terminology, and you talked about treating mental illness more easily than mental health. Could you just expand on that idea a little bit? I think we know what that might mean here in the American discourses, but in Japanese discourses, what are you seeing? Are those two things being discussed separately and in connection to one another by professionals or by the folks trying to destigmatize mental health discourses?
Yeah, so one of the things I can say is that when I went to Japan and I asked about mental health, which is generally the term that is the equivalent court term, I was met with just like very confused people. It doesn't cover the same amount of valence, and it's not, it's not the word that folks use to discuss these issues in this way. I think so. In the United States, we use the term mental health, right? And then illnesses fall under it, wellness falls under it. The yoga practice that you do to keep your anxiety down falls under it, right? But that's not the case. And so in Japan, asking about this and what, things like this were, it was often that folks talked about something like, seishinbyo, right? Like, psychological disorders. And so that wasn't met with any sort of, confusion. So if I asked about schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, folks generally had an idea of what that is. But when talking about something like utsu, like depression, well, what is it, utsubyo, or like, the official sickness, or are you just like feeling kind of down that day? And so what I noticed was, there's a huge shift between even just the time I've been going to Japan, where I have this like conservative Japanese homestay mom who, would never talk about depression, even when she was clearly depressed at times, when I was staying with her. But now, she runs a bar, and, during the pandemic, she had all her, customers around, and they talked about utsu, right? So I know that there's this infrastructure for a large psychiatric infrastructure for treating, what we would know as mental health disorders, as defined by something like the DSM. But the infrastructure for treating, everyday, and this is part of the work I have to do to equivalize it. Are we talking about wellness? Are we talking about, what are we talking about when we talk about mental health per se? And why is it important to acknowledge that as an umbrella? And so that's what I'm trying to say in this particular piece, is that the infrastructure is very much there to treat severe mental health disorders. But it's not there for like the day-to-day processes that get ignored, the stress, the anxiety, that cause folks to develop severe mental distress and disorders.
Thank you.
That
That's
makes
really
sense.
interesting. Yeah. Is there any other, we can take one last question if there is one. Stefan.
This is kind of an add-on. I came at the same question in a different way when you're talking about hikikomori. To me, strikes me, and pardon these gross generalizations, but as somewhat of a social issue, and the HSP as embodied. And there's clearly a blurring between the two, but why do you separate them, or how is it separated in Japan, and does that separation make a difference in treatment? And you've answered some of those questions.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think that there's a different moral valence to being HSP versus hikikomori, and one can become hikikomori, right, which we know is a syndrome or like a collection of different factors, versus being HSP is just like one way of experience the world, like you said, embodied. But I think the folks that are using these words are not trained medical professionals, and they're actively avoiding going to trained medical professionals. So what happens is, over time, if they find certain types of certain types of information on medical forums on the internet, or they're listening to certain influencers. So I have a good friend who is like, going through some mental health issues, and he was saying that, he felt like Japanese TikTok with like mental health problems were really taking off, and it became very popular for folks to say, oh, I feel this way, I have HSP, you might be a hikikomori. And so I think there's this like conflation that comes from lack of knowledge on behalf of like individuals. And then there is, the popularization of hikikomori as well, and sort of the casualization of the term during the pandemic. And then the fact that it's only really just now that medical professionals are starting to take these words seriously in interviews. And many folks have written about, how there's a certain level of patronizing that goes on in sitting with, a medical professional, and they doubt your lived experience or your mental experience, especially for, male Japanese doctors, which are the majority, and then, women that they treat. And it was only like in the space of in between field trips that I saw some like very prominent professionals, like Junko Kitanaka was like at first skeptical of this category. And then a year later, she was like, actually, I believe your article now. From, these conversations, I was with Dr. So-and-so, we were in the office and this came up, and he didn't know what to do with the category, but I had already heard about it from you, or things like that. So we're seeing like a real push that is very new to sort of internalize, these words might not be correct or even accurate, but they describe something. And so why separate the two? I think because it's much harder for folks to say hikikomori develops over time, right? It's something that you eventually end up in. But you can look back at your life and go, oh, I've always been a highly sensitive person. And it's more of an adjective or a characteristic than like an illness name. But folks mistake it for an illness and then use it in that way, in the same way, interchangeably.
Really interesting project, Ramsey. Thank you. And because we have to keep going, or we will run out of time. I will again encourage you to put any additional comments as you think about things into the chat, because we can all see those actually, and we maybe we'll have time at the end as well. Thank you so much, Ramsey. Let's move on, and Anran Tu is next. She's from the Visual Arts Department.
Thank you. Just one moment as I set up the screen. Okay. Okay, just want to make sure, can everybody see my screen sharing with the square now?
Yes, I can see it. I think we're good.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Turner, for bringing me up. And yeah, just generally thank you for having me here. And I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity to share my research supported by the Naiman Foundation to friends and scholars in Japanese studies. And so, brief introduction of myself. My name is Anran Tu. I'm currently a 6-year PhD student, PhD candidate in art history from Visual Arts Department. So based in San Diego, I'm currently writing my dissertation on modern Chinese art history. So this research is part of my dissertation project, which is still ongoing. So instead of presenting a completed result, I will kind of show you a story with an open end, and that welcomes questions and suggestions on how far it will go. So this project is one of the chapters from my dissertation. It explores one of the earliest Sino-Japanese cultural exchange project, the Nikka Kaiga Rengo Tenrankai. So it was not widely known even among many art historians, and I will explain why. I will explain the reason for this later. And the event began from a official initiative between a group of Japanese artists and a few of Beijing artists and collectors. So from the first one in 1921 to the last one in 1931, which is not shown here in this timeline, there are 7 joint exhibitions in total, and each time with a bigger size and then a growing scale. So moving on, let's look at who organized these joint exhibitions and for what. So the initiation began with Japanese artist, showing here Watanabe Shimpo. He traveled to Beijing in 1918, and during that trip, he connected with a few Beijing artists and collectors who are showing on the right, Jin Cheng, and he first connected with Vivian Chih, I think, and then the art who brought him to the artist Jin Cheng and Chen Shizheng, who are both very influential in the Japanese art world. So together, this group of artists and collectors planned out a joint exhibition in 1918 and 1919. But for the Japanese part, so Watanabe, he first went back to discuss with his his colleague and the leader of his artistic group, who is Araki Jippo. So they worked together, recruit other artists and paintings for the show. So in Beijing, with the private support of some Beiyang governments, some Beiyang government officials, the artists founded the Chinese Painting Research Society to prepare for the show. So there are more people involved later, and then, as mentioned, as the exhibition growing in scale each time. So here I just make a note on a very brief note on what type of art did the artists work on. So there's a glimpse of the painting from the catalogs. So they came from different groups and affiliations, but briefly, all the artists involved in these exhibitions work in a style that derived or following their cultural traditions. So as we see, mainly the initiators, they work on Nihonga, that is the national style Japanese painting, invented basically in the late 19th century. And then the Chinese artists, many of them work in academic style ink painting. So that's some called in the antiquarian style. And then the Japanese part, while the main organizers are from Nihonga artists, they also brought Nanga artists who were working on the literati style so more kind of closer to Chinese painting. So these are styles of the artist. So kind of we can see there is a traditionalist kind of orientation of this exhibition consisted. And then this is also part of the reason why many artists, art historians choose not to discuss it. Because, well, this kind of also this cultural exchange program in the narrative of modern Chinese and Japanese art history also always framed as just a cultural diplomatic project. And so they focus mainly, that means they mainly focus on the political aspect, especially the political kind of motivations for this. So they will see this kind of as, well, it's motivated by the modernism and westernization in both countries, of course. But of course, it's also kind of these Sino-Japanese cultural exchange. They usually record, well, one of the Japanese government's popular diplomacy to actually kind of relieve part of the anti-Japanese sentiment growing in post-1919, not only in Beijing, but also in every part of China. So, but as art historian, I would like to bring this attention back to the kind of artistic experience and kind of rethink our current narrative of the modern Chinese and Japanese art, which is basically national and historical based. So my questions are, what did artistic exchange mean for these artists at the moment of 1920s? And what's the legacy? And also, how did their artistic practices and historical experience, how do the transnational cultural exchange tell us about, well, the artist experience during the time? And actually, how do we actually better tell this kind of story in the history of modern art? So this last question is pretty historiography, and I just hope to show that, well, they could not be, this kind of cultural exchange project couldn't be reduced to part of an imperialist project. And then what is a better framework to think about this relationship between national art and our global modernism movements? So these are some of the bigger questions. And so with the support of Naiman Fellowship, I was able to collect a lot of necessary materials in Japan, mainly newspapers, journals, and artist writings and catalogs. So my treasure houses are the National Theatre Library and the Tobunken, the Tokyo Bunkatai Kenkyu-jo. And then also at Ueno, I discovered this restaurant called Seiyouken, and it was actually the reception place when the Chinese artists went to Tokyo in 1922. So very interesting, still exists today. And okay, so moving on, you'll see some of the members here, but generally, I don't think I have time to delve into the genealogy of Eastern art or Toyo Bijutsu in Japan, but it will be really a focus of this chapter. But let's briefly just look at all these exhibitions. So I will begin with the initiation and the first two exhibitions in 1921 and 1922. So let's briefly see here, a lot of events went on, but I want to bring the focus first to the organizers. So as I said, as discussed earlier, this giant project began with Watanabe Shimpo's travel to Beijing. So why was he thinking of this? It's kind of connected to a situation of Watanabe's group, the Dokugakai, in the Japanese art world during the 1910s. So at that time, the world of Japanese art was divided by the new school, which was represented by Okakura Tenshin and Fenollosa's Tokyo Art Academy, and the old school represented by the Association of Japanese Art. So briefly speaking, the new school was framed as the leader of modern Nihonga. So they incorporated Western techniques into traditional medium to create a new form of Nihonga, while those in the old schools, they are affiliated with the imperial family, and then they are from kind of a teacher of an artist school of long tradition. So they concern more on the continuity of the techniques and craftsmanship from the past. So Dokugakai artists, they were part of the old school, and the school founder Araki Kampo, whose picture is not shown here, was closely associated with the imperial household. And here is an example of Araki Kampo, the founder of the Dokugakai school's art, which was collected at the imperial house. So the Dokugakai artists, as we can see from this very detailed depicted peacock, can say that, well, they really focus, they are kind of a representative school of the Japanese style bird and flower painting that was characterized by detailed line work and decorative coloration that's inherited from the Maloyama and Shijo kind of tradition. So these artists connected this kind of cultural stance and connected them well with the Beijing artist who met Watanabe in late 1910s. So in Beijing, there was also a group of artists exactly in the same situation. So they were often referred as the cultural conservatives. So when Watanabe came to visit the Institute of Displaying Antiquities, so that is the kind of past museum founded in 1915. And then Watanabe paid a visit there and first met Yan Shiqing, who later brought him to Jincheng. And then Jincheng was an artist mostly working in antiquarian style, ink painting. So he was kind of a leader of the traditional artist group in Beijing. And in the late 1910s, Beijing was also famous as a site of new culture movement that actually called for full-scale westernization and kind of abandoning traditional culture. Radical artists and intellectuals in Beijing, they also gathered together, published a lot calling for art revolution and targeting mainly on the traditional style of Chinese painting. So it's exactly this kind of, this shared cultural scheme that brought them together. So here I'm showing kind of, just give everybody a sense of the style of the Dokugakai artist, well, represented by Araki Jipo on the right, and the main style that the artists want to preserve in China, represented by Jincheng. So here is a painting. Actually, he was recalling his visit to the Keigong Force at Nikon that he visited during 1922. But he was reworking this landscape, not based on actual outdoor painting and painting the real nature, but kind of based on the the visual vocabulary that he inherited from the earlier Song Dynasty landscape painting. So,
excuse me, Anran, just so you know, you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, yeah, I would go try to get really quick. So it's this kind of sharing stance against the wave of westernization that brought these two artists together. And also because of May 4th movement and anti-Japanese sentiment, the first exhibition was not launched until 1921. And then, so the first one was in Beijing and Tianjin, as shown here. Here are some of the photos of the exhibition sites. And then in 1922, the exhibition moved to Tokyo, with the Beijing artists bringing their work to Japan. So they also published a catalog after the 1922 exhibition. So for the second exhibition, which with the manifestos written by two groups of artists. So I'm not going to read everything here, but expressing the sharing ethos. A kind of this catalog is expressing a sharing ethos against westernization and preservation of cultural tradition in Asia, but especially the Japanese manifesto, it brought out the work Toyo Bijutsu, which I translated as Eastern art, so which is a central concept of their work. So for the first two exhibitions can be seen as the first time when Chinese painting first getting into touch with the world, as some of the reviewers also observed. And similarly, it was also the first time for many Japanese artists and audience to get to know the landscape of contemporary Chinese painting or what it was exactly going on in the Chinese art world. So it was an actual comparative program that was formally set up. So moving quickly into the third exhibition. So we saw at this moment an expansion with Watanabe Shimpo began to sought support from the government. So there is a special department also founded in the Asian Affairs Bureau to support the ministry, under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to support Chinese cultural activities. Here, for Chinese side, they also found this kind of exchange very promising. There is very limited Chinese governmental support because of that was before the Nanjing government was actually found, so they don't actually have the funds for this. But the Chinese artists, they would also love to seek out a lot of private supports to bring together more artists from Shanghai. It's kind of inspired by Japanese idea of bringing Kyoto school artists, Nihonga artists together. So just a group photo of the Japanese artists visiting China. And then in 1926, so there is a further development of this project. It inspired a proposal to establish what was called the Eastern Art Research Institute, the Toyo Bijutsu Kenkyushitsu. And then also in 1926, because of the Japanese government involvement, the event really grew in terms of its scale. It was kind of exhibited at two proper exhibition sites, one in Tokyo and another in Osaka. The Tokyo Metropolitan Museum of Art was right set up, and it actually kind of occupies 17 rooms to exhibit all the paintings of both Japanese and Chinese sites, all displayed together. So here, just kind of summarize a lot of progress observed also by the reviewers and also the audiences about, well, with the 5 years of this kind of exchange, what are some of the, that actually deepened understanding of Chinese and Japanese art on the culture of the other side, but also it actually promoted some stylistic change in Japanese and Chinese art. So quickly, one example here. So Japanese, as showing on the left, Japanese kind of moving from an overtly decorative and choose nature style to an elegant design that was modeled on the style of Song and Yuan dynasty bird and flower painting. So there is a heightened sense of design and emphasis on spirituality. While on the right, so there is a new trend also for Chinese artists to bring nature into their antiquarian style that used to be only based on formal languages. But the source of realism in this case was not from the Western studio chaining or outdoor sketching, but from their Japanese counterpart and the Song Yuan dynasty tradition. So to conclude, this is really quick conclusion, but kind of to conclude, I think this sharing this going on through this research, it kind of remind me to think about, well, how do we reassess this artistic experience, especially during the militarism and ultranationalism. I was unable to go into the fate of this exhibition in the 1930s in this presentation, but briefly speaking, as the Tokugakai artists, they move on to a ultra-nationalist style that was shared also by a lot of other Nihonga artists during that time. Probably their style still was adopt a lot from the Chinese part, but actually the way they frame their practice and their cultural exchange projects definitely was influenced. But on the other hand, if we moving out from this kind of teleological thinking, but then just try to think about what does this experience, what did this kind of regional affiliations inspired this artist? Well, could we actually frame this as a kind of alternative form of global modernism? And then like, how do we place these kind of activities of the traditionalist together in the landscape of modern East Asian art world that was kind of dominated by Western influences. So I think this exhibition can actually offer a very good case to kind of push a lot of thinkings on this line. So that marks the end of my presentation. Sorry if I run out of time, but thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to questions and comments and any thoughts.
Anna, thank you. This was really, really fascinating, and I really appreciate the conclusion and thinking about these regional, the regional influences, as opposed to thinking purely of a national narrative. It's really excellent, in my opinion. Okay, but there's something, let's see, in the chat from Vivian. Vivian, would you like to read your own chat?
Yeah. Thank you, Anran, for
Go ahead.
presentation. Yeah, thank you, Professor Taylor. So I just kind of saw a parallel between our presentations. So just wondering if you know whether there were any female painters involved in these artistic and cultural exchanges between Japanese and Chinese painters during the time that you presented on, and also maybe a bit more on the aesthetic interconnectedness of ink paintings from China and Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you. These two are fascinating questions. So first one, briefly speaking, there are actually women artists branded as, well, there's specific term for the women artists, 女流画家, so branded in Japan, in China, as in China alike. And Jin Chen's sister was involved in, he encouraged his sister always to paint, to kind of to just focus on some kind of painting, and then to specialize on that. And then he brought his sister's painting, and then there are a few Shanghai artists. And also in the traditionalist art world, I think in the Chinese tradition, there were these female artists, 闺秀画家 or 女流画家, who were actually encouraged to paint and to exhibit their works, and their husbands, their families will be proud for that. So there is a kind of continuing tradition. There is not that only after the modern, only those modern new women can paint, but those female artists, they are encouraged to work in specific styles. So of course, some of them exhibited their works and in these exhibitions. And for the second question, really quick, this is very complicated question. There can be there are a few books on that. So if you are interested, we could definitely talk and we could exchange emails later. Yes.
So Anran, since there's a few books on that and you can give her the reference, Stefan, you had your hand up for a minute as well. Did you have a last question?
Well, it wasn't a last question. I mean, I'd like to caution you. I like what you're trying to do, but I'd like to caution you against using the categories that Bitsushi has used to describe itself. Because you talked about Okakura as new, or, being one of the progenitors of change, when Okakura's work is very, very conservative and national. And then you talk about Araki Jippo as nationalist, and you showed an image there when I looked at that, I thought of Art Nouveau. And there's a lot of conversation going back and forth between Art Nouveau and Japanese art, or Japonism. So there's a lot going on there, and I think it'll help you to not be beholden to those categories as you're trying to understand them. And then that's especially true when you go to the global.
Yes.
And I have a simple question: of what characters the Chinese artists use to name their organization Chinese Artists Association?
That's
They
do you
use
want me to
Chugokujin? Do they use Shina-jin?
Chugoku? The Chinese artists. Oh, they always call themselves Chugoku. That association was Chugoku
Okay,
Kaiga Kenkyukai. Yes.
thank you.
So that's their words. And as far as I know, they actually didn't use Eastern art that much all the way until after the 1926 exhibition. So the Toyo Bijits kind of remain, I think, a more influential or prevalent concept in the Japanese art world. So that's another interesting question that I would really like to look into. Yeah.
I'm going to look forward to hearing more in the future about this as your work continues, Anran. This
Thank
is
you.
a really interesting area. Thank you, and thanks for all the questions. And next up is Dingding Wang, and she is from the literature department. And I think she's going to talk to us about whales.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, just okay. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to present on my research, my very preliminary research in Japan. And of course, I really appreciate the generous support from Joseph Naiman Graduate Fellowship that supported my research in Japan from 2022 to 23. I plan to divide my talk today into three parts. First, my general research interest and my research in Japan. And the third part would be the overview of my preliminary dissertation research. So basically, from September 2022 to June 2023, I joined the 10 months Japanese language and Japanese studies program called Inter-University Center, abbreviated as IUC, in Yokohama. During the program and after the program was ended, I have been going on a lot of field trips and research. And also I visited some scholars and libraries and archives across universities in Japan. I am currently a third-year PhD student in the comparative literature track of literature department here. And I am primarily interested in environmental humanities and eco-criticism, as well as animal studies, for which I particularly focus on East Asian literature, film and media, and also cultural studies. To explore ideas of, for example, wilderness, travel, and animal spaces. So during this year and a half, I visited a lot of natural spaces in Japan and also artificially natural spaces like zoos, aquariums, ocean parks, botanical gardens, seeking to understand the public discourse about animal and wildlife and also nature and conservation. I also visited some museums and exhibitions, special exhibitions regarding environment and nature. I don't know why my slides are weird. They don't. Yeah, okay. So the very field trip that sparked my interest in pursuing a dissertation project in whales and whaling technology was the one to Taiji-cho in Wakayama Prefecture. The trip was led by a senpai from our IOC program, who was also an important participant in a documentary shot about Taiji's whaling community, sort of in response to the famous Hollywood documentary, The Cove. We visited a lot of interesting places in Taiji, including the Kujira no Hakubutsukan, the whale museum, which I think is one of the few and perhaps the largest whale museums in Japan. It was renovated, but still maintained a lot of visual spectaculars in the Showa style, including this real size, model of the whaling scene positioned at the center of the museum and some gigantic genitals of whales. I'm not going to show pictures of that. They also preserved a lot of valuable archives that documented rituals and practices associated with traditional whaling, including some scroll paintings and a short film of Aya Odori, this one, which is a kind of whale festival dance the film was shot in 1932. The museum is also in Ocean Park. Like SeaWorld in San Diego, they put on a fabulous dolphin show because it was located at the Cove in Taiji, although not the one in the documentary, The Cove. So they have a large water space that is enclosed to keep about 100 or 200, from 100 to 200 dolphins of different kinds. I visited there again last summer, and at the time I also saw that they were training a smaller size whale, which is very rare and also difficult to train. And we were told during this lecture that this was part of the renovation project to transform Taiji from a notorious whaling town to the world's largest cetacean research site. And we also listened to the lecture from one of the dolphin trainers and witnessed exactly how they interacted with dolphins. I'll show you a short video. Something like that. Yeah, the trip was very informative and also rich in the sense that we encountered various interest groups who are all part of the local ecology of Taiji. We saw activists, we saw fishermen's morning catch and bidding, and we also visited the Nayaba with the owner where he processes fish meat. We also went to the fishing group's union building and talked to the representatives of the fishermen. Some of them were also in the documentaries. And this photo is the government official explaining to us the renovation project. And this one is the workshop of our senpai. And we were having lunch made by this lady whose grandfather worked as a maker of the whaling boats in Meiji period. This is another whale museum in Chiba. So an overview of my dissertation, although I'm at an early stage to collect as much information and primary sources as I can, I do want to organize these texts around these keywords, whales, whaling technologies, of course, and also the ideas of travel, empire, and modernity. I want to look at 3 of the major whaling areas during the early modern period of Japan. And as we can see from the map, all these organized whaling activities are congruent with the migration routes of whales, with one in the south with the Kuroshio Current and one in the north with the Tsushima Current. So in my research, I hope to demonstrate how humans, technologies, and ideas travel in a similar way as whales travels in the ocean. And the 3 areas would be Taiji, Wakayama, and Nagato of Yamaguchi, and also Nagasaki. So just a brief overview of the development of whaling technology in Japan. What we call the early style whaling technology, koshiki hoge, actually started from the area that is now Shizuoka Prefecture, and back then it was called Mikawa no Kuni. And they invented this tsukitori-shiki, which is the technique that they use spears to catch larger size whales in a fleet of 6 to 8 boats. And then in 1677, a fisherman in Taiji revolutionized whaling technology with the invention of tsunatori-shiki, which means they use the net to capture dolphins and whales. And that was the sort of the golden era of Japanese traditional offshore whaling. They also invented this type called oikomishiki, which means that they use they make sounds on the boats to sort of push the dolphins to swim in a certain direction, and then capture them in a cove with the net. And then in early 20th century, whaling industry modernized itself for many reasons. One of them would be the numbers of whales near shore decreased a lot because of the mass Americans whaling activities in the Pacific Oceans. So they sort of introduced the Norwegian style whaling with modernized ships, larger ships, and weaponries to catch whales. And so this modernization of the entire whaling industry has a lot to do with imperial colonial agendas. For example, exploration of the Antarctica, invasion of Korean Peninsula, and also Russo-Japanese War. So they all have a lot to do with the command of the sea. So I'm currently actually working on a chapter on whaling town in Yamaguchi Prefecture. It's the city called Nagato. And I am particularly interested in this female poet that was born in Senzaki, which is here in the top of corner of Nagato city. The poet's name is Kaneko Misuzu. I think some of you might know about her. So one of her poems got really circulated around Japanese TV after the 3/11 Tohoku earthquake. So she wrote extensively about her childhood experience growing up in this fishing whaling town Senzaki, and there are 3 poems particularly mention whaling. So in this paper that I'm writing on, I actually want to argue that Mrs.'s poetry writing is a spatial practice. And by spatial practice, I mean both physical travels and imaginary travels, mobility and immobility, the privilege to embark on a journey and the restrictions of bodily movement. Because of considering her life, which was, I think she has only been to Shimonoseki and Senzaki in Yamaguchi Prefecture, and I think a brief visit to her husband's or ex-husband's hometown. Just like a brief background information about Kaneko Misuzu, she committed suicide at the age of 26 after she divorced her husband, but her husband wants custody of their 3-year-old daughter, so she took a photo of herself and then killed herself. So I think this is just an example of the poem that I was talking about, Kujira Hoe, a Buddhist memorial for the whales, in which she sort of tried to detach herself from a human mourning, the human memorial service on the shore, and then sort of think with and feel with the whales in the ocean, right? When the village fishermen in their best clothes hurry for the temple on the shore, while alone in the open sea, a whale child hearing the bells sound, longing for its dead father and mother, longing for them so much, and it weeps. Something like that. So, and then second area.
Dingding, excuse me, you have about 5 minutes left.
Sure, okay. The second area that I'm gonna focusing on is Taiji in Wakayama. Except from the 1932 film and the contemporary documentaries that I mentioned, I'm also interested in this the scroll painting as a hybrid form of scientific taxonomy and documentation of actual whaling scenes. For example, in the image of a bountiful catch of whales in Kishu Taichiura, it's both a catalog of different types of whales and the boats and tools used in whaling, and also the pictorial documentary of the exact whaling processes. So to zoom in on the middle part, the scroll painting walks the spectator through the entire event, from the top left, spotting of the whale, and then how the fleet uses net to capture the whale, drag it back to the shore, and finally dissect it on the beach. It guides the viewer's gaze in a chronological sequence and provides a bird's eye view of not only space, but also time to create a dynamic force in documenting the sequence of events. And the last area that I focus on is Nagasaki. Hokusai has a very famous ukiyo-e of the whaling scene on the coast of Goto Island in Nagasaki. But what I'm interested in is a fiction, a short story that got Akutagawa Prize in 1961, and it was adapted into a tokusatsu film in 1962 by Daiei Film Company. And the story is set in one of the islands in Nagasaki. The story unfolds around a competition between two guys to hunt the whale god. One guy is from local, all the male family members died in their attempts to hunt the whale god. So it's pretty much like a Moby Dick-ish revenge against this whale. And the other guy is an outlaw escaped from Taiji. So there's a lot of interesting travels here. And the interesting relationship between traditional Japanese whaling in this fiction, which is more often associated with Buddhism and Shintoism, is actually in this fiction there's actually an interesting relationship between whaling and Christian church, given the particularity of the history in Nagasaki. But I haven't seen a lot of scholarly work discussing the relationship between these two. So I'm also interested in exploring more about this aspect. Yeah, so sorry. Thank you for listening. I welcome any comments and feedback.
Thank you, Dingding. This was really interesting. Ramsey, you have your hand up, and then Anran. And then Kumi. Unless Kumi's just clapping, never mind.
Yeah, I have a thought and a question. I too, like the guy, our senpai came and, I got to see the documentary. So I sort of know, where you're owning in from the documentary. And one of the things about the program that was nice was learning enough Japanese to understand what he was talking about in that context. But one of the things I was thinking about is, there's this dichotomy of views on naturalism and what the role of nature is in life going on, right? Because you have the Western protesters that come and they're like, this is a sentient animal. You can't do this. Your culture can't continue, right? But they will stomp on a bug, right? Or they will, see the death of a different type of animal. And then you have these particular folks that are influenced by an amalgamation of beliefs, right? That respect nature in sort of maybe a different way. That allows them to account for, hey, we kill these whales for sustenance and for our culture, but this doesn't mean we're animal murderers. And it might be cool to talk and to both populations to get a sense of the contrasting thought systems that allow them to be at ends with each other. And then there's also the fact that a lot of the village leaders, sorry, not the village leaders, the town leaders have, not capitulated to these protesters, but do acknowledge the concerns of the protesters. There's a lot of really interesting friction going on there. And then I had just one question. Why multi-sited? Why would studying in, all these different villages do for you? They all have interesting examples, but, what would all these places contribute that, would add to the project?
Yeah, thank you, Ramsey, for your comments and question. I actually, this is not related to your question, but I actually thought that your talk was very inspiring because it sort of inspired me to think of the life and the suicide of Kaneko Misuzu through the lens of depression and what's the word, HSP, because she was a super sensitive person. She's very alienated from her own community, the local fishing community, and then the entire children's poetry society at the time, that is pre-war. So a lot of wartime sentiments, imperial colonialism were rising. So I think your talk was actually interesting. Yeah, and regarding your comments, this is really good comments. The question why that is very interesting question, because that's like the exact question that I keep asking myself. Why, how do I put these spaces together, and how do I put these different texts of different forms and genres together? And I think that's the central question that I'm gonna tackle in the next step of my research. So yes, thank you for that. And oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to move to Anran now. Were you finished, Dingding?
Yes.
Okay, Anran, go ahead.
So first of all, Dingding, thank you so much for sharing this exciting research. I've been looking forward for this for a while. Okay, so my question maybe is you might take it as a follow-up as Ramsey's, because I'm also thinking, especially when you are showing that long hand scroll of violin from Kishu, and that remind me a lot of the hand scroll painting tradition, especially as a kind of it always used to record kind of document this kind of very eventful things. For example, like war, and especially also in your case, it's more like a religious or something, or some kind of regional thing of a religious importance, like our kind of festival kind of thing. So it also it bring me to think about, of course we are talking about violin, we are thinking about these conflicts between a traditional understanding of nature and a modern way of thinking and taking nature. And definitely there are things of the secularization of nature that's also going on in Japan. I wonder if that could be one way of dealing with the space, these issues about space, and also that painting, because of this very ritual kind of reference that based in this painting tradition. It kind of brought me to connect this painting to the title of the novel that you talk about, that you mentioned later, the Dwelling God or what, yeah. So that might be kind of a mixture of maybe question and comments, but thank you so much for sharing this research.
Yeah, thank you, Anran, for your comments and question. That's yeah, I think that's a really good question, especially considering how the scroll painting tradition to record events that has a lot of religious meanings. I am not from art history background, but with my understanding of that scroll painting of the bountiful catch of whales in Taiji, that to me that was more about recording a communal or an organized communal event. There are some religious aspect to it, but more to me, like it's more about showing off how like spectacular that visual is. And especially in the Edo period, in which they have developed the more advanced technologies of whaling, the whaling activities sort of developed or evolved into something that's very commercialized. So I think that's also sort of different from an earlier practices of whaling that are more like relied on, for example, stranded whales and smaller group whaling. So yes, so it's hard to just like have a clear cut between like pre-modern ideas of nature and then modern ideas of nature, because it's sort of just like everything's evolving, developing, and there might be overlaps. And it's also very diverse. The whaling cultures and practices in Japan is very diverse and heterogeneous. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dingding. This was really thought-provoking, and I think we're all going to be looking forward to where you take this in the future. So maybe you'll be back for another seminar later in another year or two. And let's move on now. I think our last presentation is from Dylan O'Brien from Anthropology, and I believe he's joining us from Japan.
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Sorry to everyone else presenting today that I wasn't able to see it. It's been a bit of a packed week for me. So yes, I am joining from Japan right now, and the weather is quite sunny here. So I'll share my slides. Yes, okay. And get going. Second. I haven't used Zoom in some time. Oh no. Oh no, hold on. I see how I have to do it now. Okay. Excuse me for that. Okay. I'll try and move through my slides as quick as possible and save as much time for Q&A, since this is such a privilege to have you all here. So today I'm going to talk in really general terms about my dissertation project and the topic that I look at, because I think it's an element of Japanese contemporary history and society that many people might not be familiar with. And so I'll try to give some broad outlines about the subject that I look at and the group of people that my fieldwork has been with for several years. And then move into talking about sort of what is the central theoretical conceit of my work. Okay. So up until this point, much writing about Jews living in Japan or Japanese ideas about Jews has centered on a boom in anti-Semitic books that were appearing in Japan in the post-war period from roughly about 1985 until 1995, with various, sort of bubblings up since then. Right now, due to the current sort of events happening in the Middle East, to be a bit euphemistic. Right, there's also some of this resurfacing, as well as protest against what the government of Israel is doing in Japan. But to focus on anti-Semitism specifically, different academics from outside Japan, as well as inside Japan, it should be noted, most notably Miyazawa from Doshisei University in Kyoto, have looked at what's been written about Jews by Japanese individuals in the post-war period and focused on this anti-Semitic genre, right? That roughly begins with a book, Nihonjin to Yudaijin, that comes out in the 70s. And what my dissertation begins with is this idea offered by these prior commentaries, as well as popular commentaries and things like the New York Times, the Japan Times, an English language newspaper here, the Asahi Shimbun in Japan as well, that what's written about Jews by Japanese individuals is totally disconnected, separated by some sort of gulf from Jewish individuals themselves, whether in Japan or elsewhere. And my dissertation begins with this idea that Jewish individuals are somehow totally separate from Japanese conceptions of them, and that Japanese ideas and discourses about Jews are somehow completely disconnected historically, contemporarily, from interactions with Jews themselves. So my dissertation's first chapter begins, like a number of anthropology dissertations, by sketching out the sort of historical nature of Jewish settlement in Japan in the modern era, right? So going back to the Meiji period, I look at the first Jewish settlers in Japan, and I don't mean settler in the sense of like a settler colonialist or anything, but just people that made their lives in Japan. People that moved largely from North America at first and settled in port cities like Yokohama. The first foreign language newspaper in Japan was run by a Jewish individual. And looking at this newspaper, the Japan Express, allows me to make connections with other forms of Jewish life in East Asia and South Asia around this time. Essentially, not particularly religious individuals, because being religious by yourself would have been quite difficult, but people that had the financial resources to move abroad to try and start a new business, a new life in East Asia, specifically in this case, Japan, and didn't really care too much about being anchored to a religious community, since there wasn't one at the time. So the Yokohama Jewish community grew and grew, but after the 1923 sort of devastating Kanto earthquake, this community sort of dispersed. The first community that really built up in Japan and had their own synagogue or place of worship was the Nagasaki Jewish community. And this is, again, a really great example of, just like the Yokohama Jewish community, how trends in Jewish migration to Japan aren't just Japanese in nature or having to do with, trends in Jewish life elsewhere, but are thoroughly international. So the reason that this community popped up was that Russian Jews escaping persecution wanted to, do exactly that, escape persecution. And they found themselves moving to Nagasaki because this is before the Russo-Japanese War, where the Russian fleet would dock to refuel and resupply. And so this was an opportunity for people who had been suffering persecution in the Pale of Settlement in Russian territory to escape that and yet move to an area where they could use Russian, right, for their businesses, such as running taverns, inns, in order to, be both free from persecution and make, a living. So this community rose and rose, but eventually people decided to move on to a third country. And so they sold the building and donated half of the proceeds to an up-and-coming synagogue in China, where many Jews had been moving at that point, and they donated their Torah to, at that time, the Yokohama community, right? Because they essentially closed before the Kanto earthquake. The next community that began to rise was then the up-and-coming port city of Kobe. And at the peak of Jewish life in Kobe, right around the eve of World War II, there were two synagogues. There was an Ashkenazi synagogue for Jews with a cultural background in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and then there was a Sephardi synagogue for Jewish families and people that were coming from a sort of Spanish exile background. And today, the only synagogue that's left is the Sephardi synagogue, because the Ashkenazi one was destroyed by American bombing during World War II. So the Kobe Jewish community, both of these synagogues, were very instrumental in providing aid to Jewish refugees in East Asia that came all the way to Japan, and also just to Japanese-occupied parts of China during World War II. As many people may be familiar with, there were a number of Jewish refugees that received visas in Lithuania from the Japanese Vice Consul, Sugihara Chiune, which has become a very famous story and made into a movie. But there were also other Jewish families that traveled a similar route, usually from Italy to Japanese-occupied China, in part because at the time, Shanghai was one of the only sort of visa-free places in the world that people could enter. And so it was a chance for people that didn't have a country to go to, they didn't have documents to get to a final country for safe haven. They could go to Shanghai because it was an international city and it was in disarray after the Japanese invasion, to get there and to stay there and be safe from, accelerating Nazi persecution. Today, there are still services held in the synagogue in Kobe, but in something that I'll get to in a minute, it's a rather interesting flavor in that the sort of Sephardi community that was there on the eve of World War II has largely moved on now to third countries such as America, Australia, or Israel. And so it's led by a rabbi who's not actually Sephardi. Okay. So the height of Japanese the height of Jewish life under Japanese rule, whether modern or the imperial era, was during World War II because of how many refugees there were. And so when Japan occupied parts of China, they came into sort of governing a Jewish population that had been there for a number of decades, people that had fled first the Tsar's rule in Russia, and then afterwards communist rule, and had moved to Japan. And then there were refugees as well. I won't go into much detail on this today, but basically what happened is after Pearl Harbor and America declaring war on Japan, Japanese policy towards Jewish refugees changed, And this led to eventually Jewish refugees who didn't have passports, as many European Jewish refugees has had their passports revoked and were essentially stateless due to Nazi persecution. They were eventually moved into what is known today as the Shanghai Ghetto. I'll skip this as well. So today, what does Jewish community in Japan look like? The largest synagogue and the longest running synagogue is Tokyo's Jewish community, which was built by Russian Jews that came to Japan or stayed in Japan after World War II. If you know where the Red Cross Hospital is in Shibuya, it's right down the slope from it. So, speaking to changing Jewish life in Japan, well, initially this synagogue and this community center was built by Russian Jews and the primary language was Russian. Today, it's largely American and Western European backgrounds with, an eclectic mixture of everybody from Ethiopian Jews to people from Israel to people from other parts of Asia. There's about 3,000 Jews living in Japan today, and my fieldwork is centered largely in Tokyo. I work with the synagogue whose picture I just showed you, as well as with several groups commemorating the Holocaust and sort of different multi-sited ethnography in the Tokyo area with groups that do nonprofit activities related to Jewish life in Japan or commemorating Japan's Jewish history. So the center of Jewish life in Tokyo is pretty much arguably this Jewish community center. It's affiliated with the conservative movement, which is based in North America. And so for many people coming from Israel to Tokyo, this sort of form of Judaism might be a bit at odds. And it speaks, this building's, it's been remade 3 times since 1953. And in my work, I look at how this building's transformation, right, is in a way a signal of the transformation of Jewish community in Japan in general, in that this community initially had a very small room for religious activity, and gradually that's become the sort of focal point, because in the initial post-war period, there were not many places for Russian Jews in Tokyo to go and to speak Russian and to be welcomed, as there were few social clubs for foreigners and even fewer for people that were Jewish, right? But today, many foreigners living in Japan have all sorts of social outlets. And so the primary function of the Jewish Community Center in Shibuya has become, religious sort of life, as well as educating children, as increasingly there's marriages between Jewish individuals living in Japan and Japanese people. And so there's increasingly this generation of children that are Jewish and Japanese and are being raised in Japan, and their parents are interested in providing them a Jewish education.
Excuse me, Dylan, just so you
yes.
know, you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, great, thank you. The other dimension of Jewish life in Tokyo that I look at is how do ultra-Orthodox Jewish individuals try to create community here, as well as enable ultra-Orthodox life, right? So it's quite difficult in Japan, as anybody who might be vegetarian or vegan knows, to have sort of special dietary requirements of daily life. It's very difficult if you're trying to live kosher. And so what's quite interesting is that there is a small ultra-Orthodox community led by a Chabad rabbi. There's 2 Chabad houses in Tokyo specifically. And they try to make it possible to live kosher, to follow all of the different rules of sort of ultra-Orthodox observance. However, it can be quite difficult. And many of the people you see if you go to one of the Chabad houses in Tokyo today are actually tourists, largely from Israel, that are looking for a way to, go to services on Friday and Saturday, and aren't in Japan for the long run, as it can be, again, quite difficult. And so one of the things that my dissertation looks at is people who live in Japan and for various reasons become more observant with their practice as religious Jewish individuals, and a number of whom then end up deciding that they have to leave Japan in order to actually be ultra-Orthodox, because it just does not work for them in Japan. Okay. So again, the central conceit of my dissertation is this idea that while previous commentators have said that Japanese ideas about Jews are divorced from Jews themselves and that these ideas speak to a lack of interaction, I look at things like this, and this is a photo taken in Kinokuniya bookstore in the 90s of many different sort of conspiratorial tracts about Jews written in Japanese, but at the same time, mixed in with this is solid historical research about the Holocaust by different Japanese scholars and reporters, as well as different books about Japanese individuals that aided Jewish refugees during World War II. And so when I'm often asked about my research while I'm here in Japan, and what makes it unique in Japan, sort of the ideas about Jews that we see, I say that even today we can go to a bookstore and find very serious scholarship by Japanese researchers about the Holocaust, about Jewish history, mixed together with conspiracies in a way that we often don't see these two side by side in many other places. And at the same time, it signals that these ideas, these books that are seemingly off the wall, sort of conspiratorial, aren't maybe as divorced from broader conceptions about Jews in Japan as one might make them out to be, as previous scholars have. So one of the things that I look at in my research to show how these ideas and Jewish individuals in Japan are not at all like two ships in the night, which is a quote from one of my interlocutors, is I look at this thing known as the Marco Polo incident, and I have some brief details on this about this on the slide. Basically, what this was is a major Japanese publisher during the boom in anti-Semitic literature that ran from 1985 to 1995, published by an unknown medical professional a piece of Holocaust denial, which was timed to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in 1995. And this led to an international outcry, and many people pulled their ads from Bunge Shunju, which is the publisher of this magazine. And this led then to Bunge Shunju taking this remarkable step of, in the first time in the post-war, closing a magazine in response to protest. So why do I look at this in my work? Because while in this work, in the discourse in the Japanese media and opinion pieces afterwards about this, and as well as academic accounts of this afterwards, frames it as this, out of the blue, somebody publishes this piece of Holocaust denial and foreign Jewish organizations protest, and it leads to this outcry. In reality, my ethnographic work looks and interviews different Jewish activists that had been living in Japan and how they'd been protesting Japanese publishers running anti-Semitic material for about a decade with little success. And that the whole success that then leads to the closure of this Marco Polo magazine emerged from them having learned from decades of negotiating with Japanese publishers, working with Japanese allies, and pursuing a new strategy in 1995. So rather than the story of a foreign organization coming in and using gaiatsu or foreign pressure, it's in reality a story of Jewish people who were deeply embedded within the Japanese context, working with their friends who were Japanese reporters to then pursue a strategy of saying, hey, what you're running is having negative impacts on our lives here in Japan. And this is a very different story than what academics and reporters have offered of these things are divorced, it has no impact on people. And so that's sort of a sample of how my dissertation then pursues this idea that these discourses aren't divorced from the people that they're seemingly just having these weird ideas about, and instead they're richly interacting with them and being contested. So thank you, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Kumi is clapping, yes. Thank you for your presentation. I don't see other hands up. I have one question, which I'm curious because you're in Japan now doing this research, and because of course we're all situated in universities here, all except I think Vivian, right, is in Taiwan, but we're having a lot of responses to the Israel and Palestinian war situation in Gaza. I wonder if you could say anything about the how that might be, sometimes when you're doing field work as an anthropologist, things happen that you don't anticipate, and it either opens up avenues for deeper understandings or interviews, or it closes some things down so people aren't willing to talk to you about things. So is it having an impact on your methodology and on the progress of your work?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I told myself that this was the year I only write up and that I wasn't going to do any field work, and then everything happened. And it, at the risk of sounding too detached, I'll just sort of focus on what's happening in Japan and not talk about the
Right.
situation itself. So one of the things that's been interesting to observe is that many of the people that I've done ethnography with for a number of years now found themselves reconsidering what it means to be in Japan, because strikingly and surprisingly, Japan was the first place during this current iteration of the conflict to see an attack on an Israeli embassy. So there was a far right-wing Japanese person who drove his car into a police barricade outside the embassy. And one of the things that was interesting is that a number of the organizations I worked with that were Japanese, so different Christian evangelical groups that are pro-Israel and promote Jewish life in Japan, reacted at first that they thought it was misinformation by the far left or so forth, because they couldn't believe that a right-wing person would be anti-Israel and anti-Jewish. Because historically, over the past decade, the rapprochement between Israel and Japan has been led by Shinzo Abe and the LDP. And so what's been happening is essentially there's been a lot of protests in Tokyo as well as Osaka and Hiroshima as well against Israel in support of Palestine. For various reasons, Japan has had a long-running pro-Palestine movement that's seen, documentary films, books, exchanges between different groups. And so I'd say that protests are moving to the forefront. I'd say that in general, the news is highlighting the plight of people in Gaza right now. And then what I'd say is unique and what's a shift in things is that more people are being familiarized with the conflict than before, is one shift. And then another shift is just the degree to which we're seeing an interchange through social media between different groups and their representations, which is somewhat familiar, I think, in a North American context, in that different groups condemning Israel are sharing each other's social media posts, each other's ideas, coming to each other's protests that wouldn't have necessarily been in contact otherwise, which is also something that we saw during COVID with different, for instance, environmentalist groups that were anti-vaccine coming to far right-wing liberty protests or so forth, whether in Japan or North America. So I think there's a mixing of different perspectives that is happening. And I'd say then, in my own field work, a lot of the groups that I work with have been trying to negotiate thinking about what it means to be Jewish or what it means to work on Jewish history in light of this. So there's been a tension between, for instance, some of the Jewish individuals I work with and their understanding of different Holocaust history organizations in Tokyo that are run by Japanese individuals. So the Holocaust remembrance organizations have been silent since October 7th, which has been very hard for different Jewish individuals living in Japan that have donated a lot of money to these organizations to deal with. And they sort of find themselves wondering what their relationship with these groups is going to look like in the future. So I don't know if that entirely answers the question.
Yeah, no, it's just a very interesting timing for your work, I think. Since it's 4:11 and we are scheduled to end at 4:10, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to end the formal presentations here, and then I'm going to leave this Zoom link open a bit longer because Ramsey did have a very interesting comment and question for you, Dylan. But first, let me thank all of the presenters today and also the folks who are in the audience, as it were. And we're planning, of course, to get this organized at least once every 2 years, inviting the folks who have received Naiman grants. And just as you can apply more than once to get grants, you can present more than once too. So you may all be hearing, those of you who aren't finished will definitely hear from us again. So thank you, everybody. This was really lovely to see everyone.